Hello, everyone. How are you? It's lovely to see you and to see some familiar faces. And so today, really what I want to focus on, and I've used this very deliberately, I'm talking about, youth work education and training in higher education. I have a background, as I said, in youth work myself. I did my own professional education and training in Ireland in 1985, which feels like a very, very long time ago now at this point, and then got involved in youth work education and training, first at the FET level and then also in higher education. And I've been working in Maynooth University part-time since 1997 and as a full-time member of academic staff since 2006. So what I'll be drawing on today, I suppose, is all of that experience. And I think that's really crucial when we're talking about youth work education and training in higher education. This is very much a perspective from Ireland. There are other perspectives, but what I want to try and do, I suppose, is to give you a sense of some of the insights and some of the practices that have developed. And I suppose the title of this is to know how to do and to know how to be, for me, goes to the heart of it when we think about a youth work education and training in higher education, because essentially it's a process of, I would say it is a process of professional formation. Now, in this presentation, and the various sections, I'm going to be very practical. I was asked to be very practical, so I'm not going to get too theoretical about things and look at really how you try and develop a program and what needs to be in place, in my experience, for a program to work well. I wouldn't at all be saying that what you should be doing is what we do in Ireland, because it evolves out of a context. One of the things I also want to mention here is that I'm the co-convener of a Youth Work Educators Forum in Ireland, which is a relatively recent network and something I would really strongly encourage people to think about, given that you're already part of a project, is all of the educators who work in higher education in Ireland have created a network. And we meet very regularly and we contribute to our own development of our own sort of pedagogy and our insight and look to influence things nationally around education and training. So what I'm going to do, as we said, is just give you a very short overview of youth work in Ireland and the professional education and training. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about professional formation and integrating practice development, a way of thinking about that. And then I'm going to go into some detail from an example from Maynooth University where I work, which I think will be fairly pragmatic. The reason I want to talk about Ireland at all is that one of my big things is that really the answer to most useful things in youth work, it depends, is how should we go about developing programs in higher education, is the answer will be it'll depend. It'll depend on your context, it'll depend on your history. And so Ireland, very small country off the western, off the west coast of Europe, it's looking, where us and the Irish Sea gets you to Newfoundland. We have a very small population, but we have a significant youth population. We have a history of colonization, which has really very directly impacted on youth work. And we are, a long-standing member of the European Union, a republic only since 1949, and are, I suppose, like to see this notion that we play our role in Europe. There's ongoing conversations. We have been militarily neutral, but there's ongoing conversations around that at the moment, which are sort of creating an interesting dynamic in the country. I'm not going to say very much about this, except that how youth work develops in a country matters. Context matters. So youth work, because of our history of colonization, the development of youth work in Ireland was initially dominated by that British tradition. And youth work, as you may know, in the UK really came out of a mixture, I suppose, of expanding imperialism and the Industrial Revolution, and led to what we now know as youth work. And that also sort of came to Ireland. But in Ireland, youth work has been shaped for well over 100 years now by, I suppose, our identity, our national identity, and our primarily historical Catholicism. So youth work developed out of that, and that still has resonance today. And so we have a Youth Work Act in Ireland. People will be familiar with that, perhaps, the idea that it's one of the things that people often look to into Ireland and say, oh, you have a Youth Work Act. So we do have a Youth Work Act. There's other things we don't have that I will refer to later. But the Youth Work Act is a useful starting point, although it is over 20 years old now. But it does highlight a number of aspects of what we consider to be youth work. So it places youth work in the educational domain. It speaks about it in the context of young people's development. And very directly, it talks about their voluntary participation. So voluntary participation is key to Irish youth work. It also positions youth work as being complementary to vocational and academic education. So something that takes place alongside, but outside that. And then for historical reasons, and it's interesting that this is in the Act, youth work is primarily provided by voluntary youth organisations in Ireland. And that is a very direct link to our history. And that has implications for the employment of youth workers. Historically, youth work developed way before the state got involved. The state really didn't start to get involved, and then only very slowly from the late 1960s, early 1970s onwards, but has become increasingly involved in youth work, and probably very directly since the Youth Work Act of 2001. And I say this really because it's against that backdrop. When we think about developing education and training programs in higher education, we have to take our own context into account. So what I'll be talking to you about and am talking to you about is very much developed out of our context in Ireland. We have a set of outcomes for youth work that have been determined by the government. And you can see that those there, 7 social and personal outcomes, there's nothing controversial there. There's probably the wording might be slightly different, but it's very much in line with international outcomes for youth work. So the idea that youth work is really around young people's development, based on their participation, active participation, that it is about empowerment and about agency. So when we think about designing our education and training for youth workers, it's against this sort of backdrop. To give you an idea of who is who in Irish youth work, and bearing in mind that this has developed over the last 100 years or so, we have a mixture of youth organisations, and you'll see there, say, Scouting Ireland and the Irish Girl Guide, so the uniformed organisations as they're called, huge providers of youth work to young people, but not so much the places where youth workers are employed. There are youth workers employed in the YMCA, Youth Work Ireland, Cross Care, Foróige, and some of these are Irish names, as you will see. The City of Dublin Youth Service Board is our only what might be considered a municipal provider, and it's increasingly withdrawing from the direct provision of youth work in favour of voluntary organisations. So Foróige, the Youth Work Ireland, Cross Care, YMCA are all voluntary organisations who employ youth workers. So our graduates go and work in these organisations. The National Youth Council of Ireland, who sees itself really as primarily about building solidarity in youth work, is recognised as the sort of the national body for youth work. Not that it has authority over any of those organisations, but it is the interface, I suppose, between the state and the youth sector to some extent. To give you an idea of who funds Irish youth work, you can see that it comes from a whole variety of sources. So European work there, but our department, we do have a department, which was originally called the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, is now Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. They are a primary funder and sort of driving force from the state's perspective. And UBU, Your Place, Your Space, is their primary program. But we also have youth work coming in from the Child and Family Agency, so young people in the context of their families and family support. The Irish Youth Justice Service employs a lot of people as youth justice workers, often in and alongside youth workers who are funded from other sources. And then specialist funding comes into youth work from the science focus, particularly around the digital space, and from Irish Aid, from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, looking particularly at issues to do with the SDGs, sustainability and global development. So that's just to give you a bit of a sense of some of the frameworks around it. So when we think about then, is against that backdrop, we think about professional education and training. It's been involved, we've had professional education and training of youth workers in Ireland since the early 1980s. In fact, the university that I was educated in myself and have worked and now work in was the instigator of youth work education and training at higher education, along with community development from 1980. We've had professional endorsement, and I'm going to go on and talk about that now, of higher education programs since 2006. But it's also important to know what we don't have. Youth work is not a regulated profession in Ireland. So unlike social work, it is not regulated, and it isn't a protected title. So youth work, the title of youth work can encompass everybody. So people who volunteer maybe once a week, people who volunteer long-term for significant amount of time, people who are paid full-time and part-time and sessional. So currently everybody is a youth worker. And I think that's, that's an important piece of information, because I think for some of you in the room, part of what you've been thinking about is the regulation and the title, and thinking about what gets put into law and what doesn't get put into law. When we think about higher education and we think in relation to youth work, I suppose there's a couple of things to think about. One is that before this North-South Education Standards Committee, so the NSETS, which was established in 2006, came into being, all youth work programs in higher education were and continue to be validated within the university system. So they are still undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. And for what happened in 2006 is the sector, so the broad sector and the departments north and south, so on a whole island basis, came together and developed NSETS, as we call it for short, which developed a framework to professionally endorse youth work education and training programs in higher education. And so what that means is that our programs and the membership of the Youth Work Educators Forum, our programs, as well as being academically validated within the university system, they are also professionally endorsed or accredited by the sector. And that is significant. So that is part, I suppose, of the process of professionalization. So even though we've been doing things for what might be look like a long time in Ireland, some things happen at different times and at different levels and in different spaces. It's never a linear sort of process. So the process of professional education and training precedes the development of a professional endorsement framework. I've put in the link there, and you'll get that in the slides later, to the criteria. And I think what they're really interesting, because what it means is that all of us who now in universities across Ireland who claim to provide professional education and training also have that professional education training, that curriculum, all that goes around that, has that scrutinized and overseen by NSETS. So we have to go through that process every 5 years. And it is about ensuring that we are producing people who are ready for practice. That's the key thing. And what it does too is what it's interesting. So while youth work is not a recognized profession in the Republic of Ireland, part of this, how this system works, is that there is an all-island recognition, mutual recognition, so between the north and the south of Ireland, but also between England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So there is another layer of recognition there. I think I'm not going to go through all of this, but it does, these slides, when you get to look at them early, it's about a formal recognition from the sector about a standard has been met. It's distinct from academic validation, so it goes alongside that. And it's primarily about ensuring that students and people who graduate develop a strong sense of their own professional identity and can engage critically with the field. So when we think about professional youth work and community work, or youth work in this instance, we are not only thinking about the work that might happen face-to-face with young people, we're thinking about the larger youth work ecosystem, to use the current language. And I think it does set out a sense of what the role of youth workers is. So it's about youth workers educators. It's about having a sort of a mission, an ethical basis for the practice. But what's interesting, and this is why I wanted to talk, this whole conversation really is about integration of the curriculum. It's never reduced to a discrete set of skills or a mechanical process. It's an integration, a complexity of that knowing and doing and being that I referred to in the opening slide. And it's really important is that we see that there is the intellectual basis for youth work, that youth work is not a practice only, that there is a sense that that practice is informed by values, by ideas, by concepts, and that it's in that dialogue is that professional practice is developed. I should say the other thing that we don't have in Ireland is for the country is a set of occupational standards for youth work. We have obviously a national framework of qualifications, but what we do have, the NCET's criteria for endorsement are based on the occupational standards from England originally, and those standards are also available in Wales and in Scotland. They don't have legal basis in Ireland simply because they're not issued by and stood over by the Irish state. But we all, I suppose, we all assign our programs, develop these programs around developing these 5 areas of professional responsibility, which equate to occupational standards in lots of contexts. So you can see there that the focus is on personal, social, political education, about equality and change, but that upholding that value base, developing empowering relationships, thinking about developing strategy and practice, and managing work. So that the programs are all built around and have to demonstrate how they work around those areas. Just to give you an idea, these are the institutions that are, and I've put a link to all of these institutions at the end of the slide. So you'll be able to find out about how we all approach the programs in terms of our content and our modules, etc. So what I've done here, and it basically says the title is, start at the end and work backwards. So for me, the big thing here is about when you're designing a program of education and training for youth workers in higher education, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate. And I think that the decision about whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate is very much about your own context. So in the Irish context, for instance, back in the 1980s, late 70s, we had people who were doing this thing called community work, called youth work. Sometimes largely out of European programs, anti-poverty programs, in fact. And so what we started with is we started with masters or higher diplomas that they were at the time, with postgraduate education, because there were already people working in the sector who maybe had other qualifications. So maybe in other fields that could have been anything to do with, say, social policy or social work or education. So rather than starting with undergraduate, we started with postgraduate, and then the undergraduate programs evolved around that. What I've tried to do here, I suppose, is to think about and invite you to think about the process of designing a program, an integrated program. And I think that's really important. And it goes back to what NCETs were saying. But if we think about the practice of youth work, it is an integrated practice. It's not enough to know. It's not enough to be. It's not enough to do. It is very much, as I say over there somewhere, values in action. It's theories and values in action. And so when we think about youth work practice, I think about designing a program, whether it is at higher education or postgraduate level, and maybe that's the thing that you need to decide first. And again, that's depending on your context, is think about the direction of travel. Where are you going? And what do you want at the end of this? And then it's a bit about having an organizing mind. Who are the people, the group of people, the team who are holding this idea about where you want to go and plotting the direction of travel? And ultimately, I suppose the project of professional youth work education and training is about young people and is about their right to quality youth work, and that is empowering and enhances their agency, etc. And so in lots of ways, I think if I can these are my own reflections for going back to 30 plus years, I suppose, doing this work now, is back to that hashtag, is it depends. I think we have to get comfortable with not knowing everything from the beginning and figuring things out. You know, so sometimes you have to take a step and see where it's going to go, but against the backdrop of your overall vision. Where are you going with this? I think then some of the other things is you really have to think about the program, whether again, say if we take a higher education postgraduate program, is that the overall program is a program of professional identity formation. And is, I suppose, based on ideas that theory and practice are not separate. And that can often be very challenging in some more traditional higher education settings where the idea is often that it's in academia, that the theory is developed and then it's applied in practice. But of course, in youth work, it's not so neat as that. So theory and practice are not separate. And practice is theory and values in action. So there's that level of integration there again. And I suppose what we have found is that engaging with the complexities of critically reflective practice, our own as educators, but also with students, that part of what we engage them in that process of professional formation is in the development of their own capacity for critical reflection. And that in some ways then it's about coming to some of the really, you know, challenging things is that there are a politics to professional practice. Positionality. Youth work is never neutral. You know, youth work has a set of values. It has certain stances, things it believes in, principles, outcomes, as we saw, say, going back to those Irish outcomes. So you really have to think about that in terms of that overarching, where are you going? What are the organizing minds? How are you going to start thinking about shaping this curriculum? And I would really suggest that what you do is you situate your own professional education and training pedagogy in the intellectual and conceptual tradition of your context. You know, because I'm very conscious that things have evolved differently in different countries. And in Ireland, we're very much influenced historically by the British context and by the, I suppose, ideas very much allied with sort of Western Europe. And my colleagues in other parts of Europe are always telling me, and very rightly so, that there are other ways of looking at things. So I would think that that's really important. And I would also say to you to value being eclectic. You know, so you might find there's interesting things in sociology and social policy and psychology, in economics, in philosophy, in geography, in anthropology, you know, because what we're doing is our integrated education, so that sort of theoretical dimension, and training, because it is applied. So people are coming out with skills, people are coming out being able to work as youth workers at the end of this program. And in that, I would say to you is really, and this can sometimes be challenging, depending again on your higher education institutions and how they view you know, the curriculum in higher education and what they see as learning and learning modes in higher education. But I think you have to really work hard to try and integrate non-formal methodologies into the formal program. Because from my perspective is if we are education and training people for a professional practice of knowing and being and doing, then our pedagogy has to reflect that. So we have to use methodologies that enhance people's capacity to know, their awareness of their being, and their skills for doing, if that makes sense. And then that means that you really have to think through the assessment modes. And that again can be challenging in some higher education contexts. So what's appropriate for assessing the qualified practitioner at the end of the program? And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the modes that we use. But again, depending on the institution, you might have to do some thinking about moving beyond traditional, maybe written exams or, you know, assignments or particular sorts of papers or reports. So you may have to really think about how you open up the modes of assessment. And I think it's a bit like the conversation about, I suppose, about evidence in a way. How will we know that these people are able to do the work in some way? And not just the work now, but to do all of the things we want people to do, to be able to engage in shaping the sector, to be able to influence policy, to be able to respond proactively to the emerging needs of young people, etc. Then we need to think about, well, how will you assess that? And what are the ways that we have to assess that? So I'll come back to that maybe in the next section. I suppose what I would suggest, and this is over here on the right of it, I'm sort of trying to make some suggestions about how you engage in youth work, education and training with the field. And I think the big thing is you have to activate a living and a meaningful partnership with the youth work field. So that's with practitioners and with organizations, locally, regionally, nationally. And in some way, that means then that you have to consciously and proactively blur the boundary between the academy and the field. And that's key to the credibility and the sustainability of the program. Our programs would not survive if we didn't have the active participation of the field, of practitioners, both. So we cultivate practitioners as educators of youth workers, both in the class and in the field. So that we have youth workers who come in as part of this practice development of students, you know, is to do on practical sessions on campus, or to input into youth work modules or into skills-based modules, as well as in the field. So that's a really important part. So you sort of blurring those boundaries a bit. And I suppose that's the thing is, I would say then, is you are having to, that means that you might need to be prepared to challenge what's considered to be the normal way of doing things in the university. You know, and sometimes, you know, universities can have ideas about what their role, and particularly, you know, I mean, my university is a public university, so we have ideas about public contribution and that. But I think it's also, you know, people in universities can have also ideas about knowledge and who gets to hold knowledge and who gets to be, you know, the creator of knowledge. And what we're saying, of course, and the holders of knowledge, and we're saying, well, actually, that needs to be much more open and much more blurred, so that we are also, yes, we have things to say about practice or about young people or about ideas, but the field also feeds that into us, so that we're always in a conversation. So it's really important that you're strategic, that you build your alliances within the university and outside the university as a way of doing that. All of these squiggles, I suppose, I mean, hopefully they might make a little bit more sense than being squiggles, but they're really designed for me to, but like, what are the connections, the pathways between things? And you can see that this is much more like a network or a matrix. So it's not linear. The process isn't linear, but this bit here is key, is what's the direction of travel? And then if I come down to this other blue one here, it's the place of fieldwork practice in these integrated programs. So as I mentioned earlier in relation to NSETs, is the programs, they set out a number of hours over the course of a program that a student has to be in practice in the field, i.e. working as a youth worker in an organization under the supervision of a youth worker and being assessed in that practice. And so in our programs, students spend about 14 weeks equivalent every year of their program out in the field. It's a huge part of our work, huge part of our department life, those students, and there's a whole sort of system and a whole sort of pedagogy around professional formation that I can talk a little bit more about. And in fact, colleagues and I are just about to have an article published about this, about that process of professional formation and pedagogy, and I can share that when it's out, because it's sort of, again, from practice about some of the ways that we've been thinking about that. So they're the matrix of things that have to be put together as you're thinking about program design. I'm sure I'm missing other ones. As I said, these are just some of my reflections and my insights from having been involved with this with a really, you know, committed and passionate team of people. And I think that's the really important thing, is that you have to build your team, build that organizing mind, spend time with that, developing your own critically reflective practice, thinking about your pedagogy, and thinking about ultimately the job that you're trying to do. How does what you are doing produce youth workers who are able to meet the promise of youth work to young people? So I work in Maynooth University. It's both an old university and a new university. An old university because it was set up in 1795, as a seminary for Catholic priests, and then became part of the National University of Ireland system in 1997. So it's both old and new. There's 3 faculties: arts and humanities, science and engineering, and social science. So we're located in social science. There's about 15,000 students and about 1,200 staff. So sort of a medium-sized university. Our department is the Department of Applied Social Studies. We were established in 1980, and we run undergraduate and postgraduate programs in youth work and community work. So that's the team that I lead. Social work and social science. So those are ours. So we're very much sort of the applied social sciences. In terms of our programs, what we offer, and this is just sort of an example of 2. We run what's called a Bachelor of Social Science in Community and Youth Work. It's 3 years full-time and 4 years part-time in service. And that is level 8 on our qualifications framework and level 7 on the EQF, just to give you an idea about where things fit. We also run a master's program, 2 years full-time, 3 years part-time in service, level 9, level 8 on the EQF, and you can see the number of credits. So 225 credits ECTS and 120 credits for the master's program. And the fieldwork placement dimension of it also holds ECTS. So it's alongside the full academic ECTS. And that was very important to us in our thinking and in our design of the program, that we wanted youth workers and community workers to have parity of qualification level and volume with other people in the social professions. So with with social workers, with teachers, with other people that they might be working alongside as youth workers. And again, just to give you, I'm sure you know this, but 1 credit, so when you're thinking about volume of learning, 1 credit equates to about 25 to 30 student effort hours, which includes their teaching, their study, their assessment, etc. So we run, so the Masters and the Bachelor of Science Community Work and Youth Work are fully integrated programs of education and training in both youth work and community work. So as I said that, so I wanted to look at what we mean by integrated in this context. And I think for us, it's like 2 ideas really. It's bringing traditional knowledge disciplines together in the service of fundamental important problems and questions. So our primary job is not to provide people with a degree. So as educators, our primary purpose is to provide the sector with professionally qualified youth workers. That's, so that makes a difference. So we're not only concerned with our academic qualifications, we are concerned with their ability to, as I said, to answer the promise of youth work to young people. And so the other piece of it where it is about integration is that it is, I suppose, this idea of knowledge in some ways constructed, and that the students come into us, and we can talk a little bit about our criteria if that's helpful later on. But our students come into us not as empty vessels, not as people who don't know and have to be filled with information, but they come in with life experience, with work experience, and we integrate that. So we try and integrate the learning that people bring with them into the process of the education. So it's a very particular, pedagogical approach. So just to give you an idea, so the curriculum focus is, as I said, a process of professional formation. And so academic excellence and practice competence are equally valued. And I think that's important. So for instance, if a student doesn't meet the practice criteria, they don't get the professional qualification. There's an alternate academic qualification that a student can have. So that piece is really important. We have a social science foundation. So we draw on, as I said, some of the things earlier, sociology, psychology, management, economics, etc. In our context, we have an explicit equality and human rights focus as a department. That's our starting point. We're concerned with the theory, the policy, and the practice of both youth work and community work. And each year of the program has 14 weeks full-time block fieldwork placement that is supervised. Oh yeah, that photograph is me with some of the students on a study visit. So we do study visits, and that one is to Northern Ireland to visit projects in Northern Ireland. And then the second photo is something as a Padlet, that an example of the sort of, we talked about assessment earlier. This is an example of an assignment that we get students to do, which is basically that, and I've adapted Kurt Lewin's idea that there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And we basically ask students to post twice to the tablet, to the Padlet, to ideas, articles, websites, books, resources that they think are useful for youth work practice, for doing youth work, for thinking about the work, for being a youth worker. So you can see that model of professional identity coming there. But they're also asked to say why they think the thing is important. So not just to post, but why they think it's useful. So all of the time, even in that space, they're being invited to be engaging with that reflective space as well. I'm also thinking, Zara, like if people want to ask questions as we go, there might be a good way, it might be useful to do that here because there's quite a lot here. And I'm happy to do that. You would just need to jump in and tell me if people have.
Sure, absolutely. Again, you can put hands to, you can raise the hands if you wish, and then we can see it and let Hilary, you know, if there are any hands up.
And then here we have, so these are, I suppose, some of the characteristics or the features of our programs, and it doesn't really matter whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate. So each year has a year coordinator, and that person is responsible for the student's professional formation. So they are the person who's got the overview and the oversight of each individual student in terms of their development and their professional development. We really focus on small group experiential learning where we can. So our students would very rarely be in a classroom or in a lecture theatre with, 100 or 200 other people. Sometimes they wouldn't be in a room with 50 people. They could be there with 25 or 30 people in their class group. So we use the class group as an example of a community of practice, as a group space where people also learn about being in groups, facilitating groups, conflict in groups. So it's the group as part of the mode of learning. So you can see that there's a lot here that's already reflecting some of the non-formal methodologies. We, as I said earlier, we engage practitioners as educators. We use a lot of creative methodologies. Our students do very early on. They do arts-based modules. We do study visits to practice so that people get to see. We go to Northern Ireland, for instance. We go to rural areas. We go and visit projects so that people get to see the practice in action, but also to engage in dialogue. So it's very strongly a dialogical approach. We do a whole range of assessment types, which is something I mentioned earlier in that Padlet. So we use presentations, which are individual and group presentations. We have arts-based work. We do individual and group projects. We do essays and exams. So there's a whole variety of, and we think carefully in each year about what are the sorts of assessment modes and what are appropriate to assess different sorts of outcomes. We do try, I suppose, in lots of ways, deal with the students as workers in training, which can always be an interesting dynamic. But part of the process, and say part of what NSETS requires, is an 80% attendance requirement. So we do, but we also expect people to learn. This is also about sort of a socialization into a profession, into a community of practice. So we learn, we are quite clear about ideas around attendance, sick certs, negotiating, leave, etc. We have a restricted entry recruitment process. So it means that we will have met everybody who comes into our programs at least once. So we interview all of the students, or prospective students, at the point of entry. So if we start in September each year, our interviews take place in April. Usually we're part of a national higher education sort of entry system. It's called the Central Applications Office. As I said, students have to pass their fieldwork placements And there's an exit award if somebody doesn't, if either they choose not to or they're deemed not to pass. I think in our final years, these are some of the features of the program, is that students have to do a final oral exam. And that involves external examiners and practitioners examining students at the point. So it's almost like an exit interview. It's almost the final gatekeeping piece. And we also ask students to make final year values presentations. So they have to make a statement around their professional identity to peers. What are their values? What are the principles? What are their practice commitments? So it's something about they have to look back on their 2 or their 3 years and look at how they have developed and how their identity has developed and make a statement about themselves as practitioners going out into practice. So there's sort of some of the very practical dimensions of the program. And each of those I could trace back to the Padlet, to one of the points that are made on the Padlet. But I won't ask you to do that. So here is an example of some of the themes that we pick up on in the modules. So there's obviously youth work principles and practices, community work principles and practices, youth and community arts, professional practice skills, youth justice, management, international youth work, group work, conflict and mediation, equality and human rights, comparative and international studies. So that's also where obviously we would look at European work. Sociology, we have a strong commitment around, global youth work and development education, and psychology. So that gives you a sort of flavor. I mentioned earlier about being eclectic. This sort of gives a sense of where we draw in our service of, producing competent, qualified youth workers. This is what our curriculum is based on and is shaped on, these themes. And these themes then get expressed through the modules. But you can see here, this professional skills, practice skills, is a big part of sort of an underpinning core of the program all of the ways through. Are there any thoughts or questions at this point, or will I move on? Okay, I'll move on.
Yeah.
Okay, this is really something to look at later rather than now, but it just gives you an idea of the modules that people do. And you can see that the modules, so the bachelor's program is 225 credits over 3 years full-time or 4 years part-time in service. And the master's is 120 credits over 2 years full-time or 3 years part-time in service. And you can also see between the bachelor and the master's there's an awful lot of similarity around the module title. So the students effectively study the same topics and they come out with the same professional qualification. What's different is the level of their academic qualification. And for our undergraduate students, you can see that we put a lot of work here, saying early on, study and inquiry at 3rd level. We talk about the introduction to the social sciences. So here, maybe you're looking at public administration. You're looking at, you're looking at equality. Whereas, later on, there's the applied social sciences, and then there's the social science context of practice. So we start with, say, for instance, public administration, and then work our way into, say, social policy over 2 years. Professional studies is made up of, it's where your management comes in, your equality comes in, those sorts of things. So there's a detailed module descriptor that goes with all of these. So what I asked and I thought might be helpful for you is I was going through a process a couple of years ago around evaluating some of our programs and looking at the master's program in particular. And what I did was I had some conversations online with some of our master's graduates, because I thought that level might be interesting. And I asked people to give us an indication on Menti of the impact of their degree on their life, on you, your life, and your work. And I think that's the thing. It's back to that thing about NSETs we're saying about this isn't a discrete, units of learning. It's an overarching sort of process. You're taking people on an educational process throughout the 3 years. So these are some of the things that people said, around the impact of the program. So you can see transformative there, I'm glad to say. but also, I suppose, having a sense of, you know, that professionalism piece, that notion of being reflective, having an analysis, you know, being insightful, having confidence, you know, so that sense of people who are able to engage with the changing landscape of practice, you know, who are not just reactive, but are also proactive in that. And I think maybe in that context, it's important to look here again, just for a second, at these modules. So you can see each of these modules have a module descriptor. And so they look like they stand alone, but actually we've put quite a bit of time. It's one of the things I'm working on at the moment with colleagues is devising our timetable around what's the sequencing of things, what learning experiences work well together, what are the connections that people need to make in order to be able to make sense of the next module. So it's a sort of that we think about that organizing mind piece again, we think about that in a fair bit of detail. I also asked people to think about the way that the master's program, I suppose, you know, what difference it made to them. So I looked at some of the things, you know, so I said, offered them what was the ways it made meaningful opportunities for learning individually in groups that deepen their knowledge of community work, youth work, and social justice. Develop their capacity for analysis and to formulate action based on that analysis. Opportunities to develop, to reflect and articulate the professional values. Provided opportunities to practice. And I think that's really important. There's a whole seminar, I think, on practicing practice, which is effectively what your fieldwork practice is about. But also how you engage, how students engage in college, how they deal with their issues about attendance or sickness or whatever, is all about practicing practice skills and prepare them well to work as a professional youth worker or community worker. So, you know, I was happy enough, I have to say, with that sort of feedback from, I think it was 2 or 3 cohorts of master's students a couple of years ago. Here's just some of the contact details, my own. Please do feel free to make contact. I'm always up for a conversation. You can probably tell that this is something that I'm passionate about and always happy to talk about. These are a very small sample of some of the online resources that are available for curriculum that I have found really useful. The first one there, youthworkandyou.org, is actually a project of our university on an Erasmus plus KA2 that we developed with HUMAC, with Tallinn University, with Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia, and with Ulster University. And it's a whole set based around now 7 modules now, a whole set of curriculum resources that are open source, interactive. You can use them, you can adopt them, you can do whatever you like with them. The youth knowledge books you already mentioned, I think they're a really excellent resource. Colleagues from HUMAC and Plymouth and Estonia from Tallinn worked on a book a couple of years ago around teaching youth work in higher education. I think there's some really good resources in that. The T-kits, of course, from the partnership, the toolkits, I think are excellent resources. I know the one on conflict we use a lot. It's really excellent. It's being developed. And then a project you may have heard about is from Salto. It's called focuslearning.eu, and it's got a lot of really good resources on exploring learning in youth work, and youth work is a learning space. So I think it's a really good time in lots of ways around the development of curriculum resources for us in youth work. And there's increasing, I suppose, interest in sharing those resources and talking together and sort of developing resources. So they're just a couple. I'm sure there are very, very many more. And then these are just the contact details or the websites of all of the NSETS endorsed providers in Ireland. So there's our colleagues over in the West in ATU, on the East Coast in Dundalk Institute of Technology, ourselves in Maynooth, Technological University in Dublin, UCC in Cork, and University of Ulster. And you'll be able to, if you go into those websites, you'll be able to see their, you know, the modules and how things are made up and how the program is described. You might find that useful. And then this is it. Are we there yet?